Thank you all. It's a joy to be here. I know so many of you. It's a thrill to be here with you. I'm very much looking forward to Bishop Homening's talk tomorrow and his homily. Sister Mary Claire, I esteem the Carmelite sisters so very highly, and I'm glad that three of you are here with us. Candida, I've known you for many years. Your talk last night was superb. It's good to be here with Father Matthew, our provincial, Father Adam, our provincial delegate. We thank them for the Phoenix community for all they've done to organize this conference, especially Cherry Caparas. She deserves so much credit. I'm very happy that Father Michael Joseph Paris is here. He is a rising star. You watch what I say. In 2022, he interviewed me for a Carmel cast for ICS Publications on the Poetry of Saint Thérèse. How many of you saw that? A few of you. Good. Some of what I said then I'll need to repeat then, but hopefully what I say today will be a little better than before. The title of my conference is The Poetry of Saint Thérèse in the Night, and I mean her night of faith, her trial of faith. In the night, I sing simply what I want to believe. That's a quotation from Manuscript C of Story of the Soul. I'm going to be talking mainly about her trial of faith, the last 18 months of her life. I finished translating the poetry of Saint Thérèse for ICS Publications almost 30 years ago, a long time ago. I finished it, and it's hard to believe that so much time has gone by. I'm not a poet. I knew before I started that any translation I could do would be on a level far beneath her originals. Then, before I began, I consulted with a venerable priest from the Washington province, Father Kieran Kavanagh, one of the founders of the Institute of Carmelite Studies, and I asked him whether I should dare to take on this project, and he really encouraged me. He advised me to aim for a certain poetic sense of her work. And so that's what I've tried to do. You know, Father Kieran died in 2019, and we miss him. There's been another translation of the poetry about the same time as mine from Mother Agnes's corrected manuscripts. It rhymes, but it changes, for me, it changes Saint Thérèse, making her une grande dame, a great lady. And she wasn't like that at all. The poetry of Saint Thérèse is so simple and delicate and pure, like she was. And she says in the title, I simply sing what I want to believe. And that's deliberate, to be simple on her part in her poetry. She had no literary training at all, yet the more she wrote, the more her talents blossomed. It was an infused grace of which she received so many. I don't have to tell you that. A few months ago, the order sent out some of her poems and letters for each of our communities to discuss on Saint Thérèse for this centenary year. The nuns, the friars, the secular order members were discussing different texts from Saint Thérèse. And for the poetry and for the letters, no translator was given. And I was curious about that. I had never read this translation of the poetry that you've been discussing for the last few months in community. And I did a little research through our generalate in Rome that the name was not to be released. So to be honest, the translation that you've been reading in community of the poetry and now the letters is not an improvement. You have the very best translation available of Saint Therese right now with Father John Clark, Story of a Soul, and the letters and the last conversations is superb. And I wouldn't touch it. We can never get a perfect translation. Traditore, to translate is to betray, as the Italians say. The reason I translated Saint Therese's poetry was for the introductions to each poem. I knew my translation would be far inferior to the original, but the introductions to each poem are magnificent. I did not write those. The big specialists, the big scholars, the big names in France, especially Bishop Guy Gaucher, the world authority on Saint Therese, who died in 2012, they translated these introductions to each poems, and they're brilliant. You'll find new information about her that you won't find anywhere else, and I highly recommend them to you. There are 54 poems, plus some fragments of poems. It's interesting, Therese never wrote poetry before she entered at the Benedictine Abbey or at home where she was homeschooled. She never wrote a poem. Her first poem was written in 1893 when she was 20 and had been in the monastery for 5 years. She wrote this poem at the request of Saint Teresa of St. Augustine. Does that name ring a bell to you? Saint Teresa of St. Augustine was the sister who was so austere and strict. Some of the sisters called her the image of the severity of God. Do you know the archives for the Carmel of Lisieux? If you don't, you have to see this. A number of years ago, the Carmelite nuns in Lisieux put all their archives, their vast archives, on the internet, and almost everything is translated into English. It's in English, Archives, Carmel of Lisieux, and it'll all come up to you. But all the obituaries of the nuns that she lived with are there. And there's a fascinating obituary of Sister Teresa of St. Augustine. And this is what St. Therese wrote about Sister Teresa of St. Augustine in Story of a Soul. There is in the community a sister who has the faculty of displeasing me in everything. In her ways, her words, her character, everything seems very disagreeable to me. Not wishing to give in to the natural antipathy I was experiencing, I told myself that charity must not consist in feelings, but in works. So I set myself to doing for this sister what I would do for the person I love the most. Sister Teresa of St. Augustine asked St. Therese to write a poem, and so St. Therese overcame her reticence for writing and wrote her first poem. All her other poems date from a year later, from February 1894 to July 1897, when she had to be brought down to the infirmary and couldn't even use a quill, and then couldn't even use a pencil. So she wrote 53 poems in 3 years and 6 months. That's more than one poem a month. She wrote 4 of these poems for a sister who was not at all nice to her, Sister St. Vincent Depal. Does that name ring a bell to you? The second of the poems, My Desires Near Jesus Hidden in His Prison of Love, contains the theme of this Congress, By His Presence I Am a Living Monstrance. And Candida Kirkpatrick spoke on that very beautifully last night. I won't mention anything more because Candida did such a good job, but you and I are meant to radiate Jesus to other people. Sister St. Vincent de Paul was a lay sister. She spent all day long in the kitchen, and her obituary speaks of her great devotion to the Eucharist. But there's a little something strange with that. she insisted, when all the nuns were in choir praying for their hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, she insisted that she wanted to pray prostrate on the floor. I have never heard of another community anywhere that would allow such a thing. That would be so distracting for anybody. But maybe the prioress allowed it in her case, because once she stood up, watch out, she was an incessant talker. And from the time Saint Therese entered the monastery, Sister Saint Vincent de Paul took a malicious pleasure in embarrassing her. When she was a postulant, and Sister Saint Therese was very recollected and would take her time going anywhere, Sister Saint Vincent de Paul would see her and say, "When is that kid going to get to work?" And would embarrass her very much. But Saint Therese would always smile and not answer back. Later, when Saint Therese was in the infirmary and had developed gangrene of the intestines with very embarrassing consequences, one day Sister Saint Vincent de Paul brought her a cup of gravy to drink. And Saint Therese, she couldn't even smell it. And Sister Saint Vincent de Paul was very offended by that and went out of the infirmary. She's not a saint. She's not even a good religious. As I said, Saint Therese wrote 54 poems, 8 plays, all written in verse, her autobiography, Story of a Soul, the 220 letters she wrote in her 9 years in Carmel, and a number of formal prayers. That makes us realize what a prolific writer and hard worker she was. Almost all her poems were written when one sister or another, or the prioress, would ask her to compose a poem for a special occasion, a clothing, a profession, an anniversary. We know that her sister Céline and Carmel, Sister Geneviève, that she never refused a request for a poem. Sometimes her poems would be intended for the whole community, and she also wrote poems for her family and for her 2 spiritual brothers. And this is how she wrote her poems, and I find this really fascinating. First, when she knew she had a poem to write, first she would think of a melody, and then she would compose the poem in her head to match the melody. Like if you asked me to write a poem and I chose Amazing Grace and wrote the poem to go around Amazing Grace. And when she would finish the poem for this sister or that sister, she would always write the melody that she recommended on the page. And for the 54 poems, she writes 39 different melodies that she recommends. She writes in the title for this Congress, for my talk, "I simply sing what I want to believe." I've never heard that Saint Therese had a solo voice. She could carry a tune. The one in the family who had a beautiful voice was her first cousin, Sister Marie of the Eucharist, and I'll bring her up in a minute. I have a book to recommend to you. Her sister Céline and Carmel, Sister Geneviève, wrote a book in French in 1952, years after Saint Therese was canonized in 1925. And the book was translated into English in 1959, the year Céline died. And you can order it on Amazon. It's called A Memoir of My Sister Saint Therese. And it's very nice. I was reading some of it on the plane flying here on Thursday. And Céline says again that Saint Therese would compose all her poems in her head during the day as she went about her daily routine, as she worked or at prayer time. And apart from free days and Sundays, she had to wait until she got back into her cell that evening to write down what was in her head. Now, I have one agreement. The introduction to the poetry is, again, I didn't write it, I just translated it, and it's very beautiful by all the big scholars, but I have one disagreement. They write, almost all the melodies Therese chose for her poems are badly dated now, like ladies' hats in old family photos. Far from enhancing Therese's poetry, the music she chose can even make them seem ridiculous. I strongly disagree. We want to know everything about her, and it's fascinating what melodies she was humming, going through her head as she worked and prayed and went about her day. Now, I'm going to play you very short selections from 3 of her poems, and we'll see technically if this is going to work or not. There have been many versions of her poetry in French. This was done by a community of Carmelite nuns near Paris in Daumont, and it's obvious when you hear that the nuns had no singing training. But there's musical accompaniment, the organ or the harpsichord or the zither. But before Vatican II, none of the Carmelite nuns were allowed to have any musical instruments. That was, again, against poverty. You know, Elizabeth of the Trinity, the consummate award-winning pianist, who was just a few years younger than Saint Thérèse and who entered the Carmel of Dijon, she would practice before a competition. She would practice 5 and 6 hours a day. But when she entered Carmel, she never touched a keyboard again. And she never mentioned her piano again in any of her letters. What virtue that was. Well, let me go ahead and pray one song for you, and we'll see if this works. This is one of Saint Therese's first poems. It's the 5th poem she wrote. It's called My Song for Today, Mon Chant d'Aujourd'hui. And Candida referred to it last night. She had it on her amazing slide show, and Father Michael Joseph referred to it today. What she's saying is, we only have today. Today is what counts, and let's live today to the full. And I'll just pray you 1 minute of it. Can you hear that? My life is but an instant, a passing hour. My life is but a day that escapes and flies away. Oh my God, you know that to love you on earth, I only have today. Oh, I love you, Jesus. My soul yearns for you. For just one day, remain my sweet support. Come reign in my heart. Give me your smile just for today. Isn't that beautiful? Can you hear it? So Saint Therese, when she had her finished draft of a poem, she would write it out in calligraphy and sometimes paste it on a photograph or a holy card. And Céline wrote that out of self-denial, Saint Therese never kept a copy of her poetry for herself. She gave everything away. And when she wanted to make a copy a year or a year and a half later, she would have to go to that sister. Could I please borrow back the poem that I wrote for you? She had very little free time. The nuns prayed in the chapel 6.5 hours a day. When they were not praying, they were working or had 2 hours of recreation altogether. And the only free time the nuns were allowed was from noon to 1 and from 8 to 9 in the evening. And this is another fascinating example of how Therese would compose a poem. And it helps us to catch a glimpse of her. She was a genius. She was so intelligent. My favorite poem of all, Vivre d'amour, Living on Love, she wrote 14 stanzas in her head. During 3 days, the nuns had adoration, perpetual adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. All the Carmelite nuns in France spent 3 days of prayer before Ash Wednesday, before the Blessed Sacrament, to make reparation for the sins of Mardi Gras and Carnival in France. So Saint Therese was composing these 14 stanzas, but it was only at the last day, the last evening, that she was able to go back to her cell and write them all down. That year, 1895, when she was 22, was a year of peace, love, and light for her. It was a peak year, a mountaintop year for Saint Therese. She was very happy and fulfilled. She was continuing her work as the unofficial novice mistress. She was writing that first part of what came to be known as Story of a Soul under obedience to Mother Agnes, Pauline, reflecting on her life, her vocation, on the mercies of the Lord in her life. She wrote 9 poems that year. And you know, on June 9th of that year in 1895, during Mass on Trinity Sunday, she received the momentous inspiration to offer herself as a victim to God's merciful love in order to live in one perfect act of love. I offer myself as a victim of Holocaust to your merciful love. Her health had been good that year, except she had developed a raw, hoarse voice for the last few months, and she couldn't get rid of it. And the sisters were worried about her, but she kept saying, "Oh, I'm fine. Don't worry about me." But the winter of 1895 and into 1896 was rigorous, and there was no heat in the Carmelite monastery. On the evening of January 20th, in 1896, it was the vigil of the Feast of St. Agnes, Pauline feast day, the prioress's feast day. As St. Therese went into the choir for Vespers, she took her copybook that she had been working on for a year, writing down her childhood memories. She took that, and the prioress hadn't come in yet, and she just put it on the prioress's choir stall. That is what we now call Manuscript A, the first part of Story of the Soul. And Mother Agnes did not know that she had just been given one of the great treasures of the church. But she was very busy. She took it up and flipped through it and closed it and stuck it in a drawer. And she didn't open it again until well over a year later, when St. Therese, Mother Agnes found out that St. Therese was already very ill. On that same day, St. Therese gave Mother Agnes a lovely poem she had just written called The Responses of St. Agnes, inspired by the antiphons of the Divine Office for the Feast of St. Agnes. And that night, she and the novices put on a play that St. Therese had written and directed called The Flight into Egypt. They had really worked on it and practiced a lot. But Mother Agnes didn't like it, and she stopped it before it was over. She said it was too long, and St. Therese was tiring out the community. And St. Therese was seen crying backstage. That hurt her so much. In March, the very divided community held elections for prioress, and Mother Agnes was not reelected for a second term. Mother Marita Gonzague, who had been prioress a number of times, was reelected on the 7th ballot. Then came Lent, and St. Therese writes, God granted me the consolation of observing the fast during Lent in all its rigor. Never had I felt so strong. Well, on Holy Thursday night, she went to bed at midnight. She had been fasting and she had been working hard all day. And she put her head on the pillow and she coughed up something and she caught it in her handkerchief. But out of obedience, it was against the rules to turn on the lantern at night. So she said, I'll wait until tomorrow morning to see what is there. Well, she had coughed up blood. And the next night, the same thing happened. And each time she went to the prioress and she said, Mother, this happened to me last night, but please don't say anything. I'm fine. I can continue on with my life. So a doctor was not called in. Tuberculosis was the dreaded disease of the 19th and 20th centuries, up to 1949, when streptomycin was discovered. In France, about 150,000 people a year contracted TB. The area of Lisieux had one of the highest rates of TB in France, and St. Therese's age group had the highest risk. The Carmelite monastery in Lisieux is located right next to a river, and the monastery is cold and humid. In 1995, Father Matthew and I were privileged to be asked to represent our province at a 2-week special course for Carmelite friars, all from all over the world, in Lisieux, to prepare for St. Therese's centenary of death in 1997. And we were wondering, will they invite us inside? Will they invite us inside? And finally, just a few days before the 2 weeks were over, the nuns did invite us all inside, and that was a thrill, as you can imagine. Well, my first impression of the monastery when I entered the famous enclosure door, and Father Michael Joseph spoke so beautifully about that in his talk. Therese had knelt down there to receive her father's blessing, and he had knelt down to bless her and then say goodbye. My first impression at this enclosure door was the very strong, unpleasant smell of mildew. It just didn't smell healthy. When Therese was dying in the infirmary, she confided, I thought I would die of the cold. And really, she did. At the Carmel of Lisieux, there were 5 sisters who died of tuberculosis from 1896 to 1914. A turned sister, Sister Marie Antoinette, who died just 10 months before Therese. Therese died in 1897. Then her first cousin, the one with the beautiful voice, contracted TB then. Marie Guérin, Sister Marie of the Eucharist. And then a young prioress, Mother Marie-Ange, who died at 28 in 1909. And then Sister Isabel of the Sacred Heart, who died at 32 in 1914. The word tuberculosis was hardly ever mentioned during St. Therese's illness because TB was the AIDS of the 19th century. The highest infection rate was among poor people in ghettos who sometimes were not leading good moral lives. But just think, the Carmelite nuns in their close quarters eating a poor diet, their life was not very different from some poor people in ghettos. The moral life was, of course, very different. But St. Therese's illness during her lifetime was referred to just as pulmonary congestion. She describes her spiritual life up to that turning point, Good Friday, 1896, Up until then, I was enjoying such a living faith that the thought of heaven made up all my happiness. Do you know the book by Father Pia, Story of a Family? I really like it. It's an old book about Saint Therese, which tells all about growing up in her family. And all the section about the 4 children who died in infancy and how tragic that was. But Father Pia said, the whole family lives as if they were looking out the window up to heaven. That God would bring them through this hard trial, and that they would all be reunited again in glory. Saint Therese, after she was coughing up blood, she continues in her autobiography, Jesus permitted my soul to be invaded by the thickest darkness, and the thought of heaven, up until then so sweet to me, was then no longer anything but a cause of struggle and torment. So what a shock with all those sweet thoughts of heaven that she had had before were abruptly taken away. And in Manuscript C, she spends 6 pages writing about her trial of faith. Most of her poems, about half, were written after she first coughed up blood that Holy Thursday and Good Friday in 1896. It was about Easter Sunday that she entered the night of faith, which lasted until her death 18 months later. And the title of my conference is taken from these lines. My dear mother, Mother Marita Gonzague, I must appear to you to be exaggerating my trial. In fact, if you're judging according to the sentiments I express in my little poems composed this year, I must appear to you as a soul filled with consolations, and one for whom the veil of faith is almost torn aside. And yet, it is no longer a veil for me. It is a wall that reaches right up to the heavens. When I speak of the happiness of heaven and of the eternal possession of God, I feel no joy in this. And here's my title, for I sing simply what I want to believe. And those words, I want to believe, she capitalized them. On a computer now, we would put them in bold letters. I want to believe. That is her cry for help. Saint Therese never uses the term the dark night from St. John of the Cross. Scholars are not sure if she ever read St. John's book, The Dark Night, even though she wrote in Story of a Soul that when she was 17 or 18, she had no other nourishment, spiritual nourishment, but him. She could have been helped by your formation guidelines. Probably St. Therese had not read these scary sentences from The Dark Night, in which St. John of the Cross describes the purification she was going through, the purification that it takes to be a great saint. And I quote from The Dark Night, Part 1, Chapter 8. The night of the senses is common and happens to many. The night of the spirit is the lot of a very few. The night of the senses is bitter and terrible, but nothing can be compared to the night of the spirit, for it is horrible and frightful. And both of these is what St. Therese was living through and lovingly surrendering to God through during the last 18 months of her life. Bishop Guy Gaucher in The Passion of St. Therese, that's a wonderful book you could read. I recommend that to you. He wrote, many people know what it is like to be crushed by physical sufferings. A lot of you know that. Countless sick people experience the emotional anguish of being overwhelmed by feelings of annihilation and the temptation to despair, even suicide. St. Therese was very strongly tempted to suicide at one point. but to experience both of them at the same time, especially when one is Saint Thérèse, that is to say, when one is highly sensitive and intensely receptive, would be beyond my words. She had violent temptations against faith with obsessing doubtings, especially about her salvation. She describes it as a black hole, a wall, a tunnel, a fog, a night, a darkness, my trial of faith. But she keeps saying all that it's indescribable, it's incomprehensible, it's tormenting. She was afraid to say too much about it because she didn't want to lead anybody else into what she was going through. But she has a poem to her heroine, Joan of Arc, that gives us a hint of what she felt. She describes Joan of Arc at the bottom of a black dungeon laden with heavy chains. That's how Saint Thérèse felt. We know in our day, Mother Teresa of Calcutta went through a dark night for a much longer period than Saint Thérèse, and their dark nights were very similar. Now, Saint Thérèse consulted with her chaplain, Father Michael Joseph mentioned this, who was a very scrupulous old man, and she told him about what she was feeling, and all he could say was, "Oh, don't dwell on those things. That's dangerous. Don't talk about that." Well, that didn't help her very much. There was a very fine Norbertine priest, Father Godefroy Madeleine. He was the first reader of Story of a Soul when she died, before it was published. He gave the nuns community retreat the last year of St. Therese's life in 1896. And she went to talk to him twice about what she was going through. And he later testified at the beatification process. And this is what he said: her soul was passing through a spiritual crisis. She believed she was damned. It was at that time that she increased her acts of confidence and abandonment to God. Now, here is a poem that she wrote during this time. It's called My Joy. My joy is to stay little. When I fall on the way, I get up very quickly, and Jesus takes me by the hand. Then I cover him with caresses, and I tell him that he's everything to me. And I'm twice as tender when he slips away from my faith. It was Jesus, her only love, who was hidden deep within her soul and who strengthened her and brought her through this trial. She didn't know, as I said, she didn't know St. John's dark night, but she certainly knew these lines on the death of love from the living flame of love. Do you know this quotation? It is vital for individuals to make acts of love in this life, so that being perfected in a short time, they may not be detained long on earth. She had discovered those lines when she was a postulant, and all during her 9 years in Carmel, she read and memorized and truly lived them out. And in her last conversations when she was in the infirmary, she mentioned these lines several times more. What does that spiritual director, that Norbertine priest, Father Madeleine, what does he mean when he asks her to increase her acts of confidence and abandonment to God? How would she do that? Well, he advised her to write out the creed, in Latin, of course, it would have been in that day, on a sheet of paper, and to wear it under her scapular. And then whenever during the day she was feeling alone or God was far away, when she was going through a trial, she would just touch her heart. And nobody would know what that meant except her and the Lord. Well, she did a little more than that. The next time she coughed up blood, she wrote out the creed in her blood. And that's what she wore in the pocket under her scapular that she would. And the nuns, after she died, the nuns still have that paper. So following Father Madeleine's advice, she wrote, "I believe I've made more acts of faith this year than all through my life," over and over again. At each new occasion of combat, when my enemy provokes me, I conduct myself bravely. I turn my back on my adversary, the devil, without deigning to look him in the face, and I run toward my Jesus. I tell him I'm ready to shed my blood to the last drop, to profess my fate and the existence of heaven. Why all these images of blood? Well, in July, Saint Therese began coughing up blood without interruption for 29 straight days. And there were little aneurysms in her lungs, and the danger was instant death just to turn in bed at that time. I had a breakthrough when I was preparing for this conference. Saint Therese and her sister Celine, too, came to my rescue. This is the key to my conference, this one sentence. Celine said, and I'll drink it. Saint Therese triumphed over her temptations by often making acts of faith, and in composing her poems, the echo of a soul on fire with love. She triumphed over her temptations by often making acts of faith, and in composing her poems, the echo of a soul on fire with love. She was making deep, tremendous acts of faith in the God she had lost. And writing these poems helped her to reach out to others, but it also strengthened her. It was something that she was doing for others, but that really helped her. And here is the third and last of the poems that I'll play for you. Why I Love You, Mary. Saint Therese, in May of 1897, she said, "There's still one more thing I have to do before I die. I've always dreamed of saying in a song to the Blessed Virgin Mary everything I think about her." And that's, I'm going to play just one stanza, and it's the stanza of Jesus lost in the temple and what that was like for Mary. Since the King of Heaven wanted his mother to be plunged into the night in anguish of heart, Mary, is it thus a blessing to suffer on earth? Yes, to suffer in loving is the purest happiness. All that Jesus has given me, he can take it back. Tell him not to bother with me. He can indeed hide from me. I'm willing to wait for him till the day without sunset, when my faith will fade away. All this time in the infirmary, she was never stiff or rigid. She was always sweet and smiling like a little girl in the arms of her father. Or she was the wise, strong warrior At the end, she was very much like Jesus on the cross, struggling to breathe. She was very aware that suffering alone gives birth to souls, as she says in the first part of Story of a Soul. And this is what she says on the last day of her life, just a couple of hours before she died. She said, "Never would I have believed it was possible to suffer so much. Never, never. I cannot explain this except by the ardent desires I have had to save souls." Everything was to save souls. In the 5 years I've been in Oakville, I've taken calls from hospice to visit people who are dying. And I have to tell you that this has been a very beautiful ministry to me. I miss it when I don't get a hospice call. And I've gotten to know the hospice director a little. And she told me that some people who know that their condition is terminal, they want to have everything in order for their family. They'll get their will in order. They'll make their funeral plans. They'll call a priest for the apostolic pardon. Have you done that for yourself? Especially if your caregivers will not be practicing Catholics. That's very important. I have seen that for a beautiful Catholic to be dying, and the caregivers completely neglect the faith of the person who can't do anything about it. Most terminally ill people go through the stages of dying of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But my hospice specialist friend told me that a few people, however, pass through these stages very quickly. Saint Therese had already been through some of these stages after her mother died, from the time she was 4 to 14 with her Christmas conversion. In October of 2023, Pope Francis wrote an apostolic exhortation on Saint Therese, which did not receive the attention it deserves. I'm very surprised no one has mentioned that until now. He entitled it, "It is confidence, and nothing but confidence, that must lead us to love." And he quotes the passage that I've used in the title of this talk today. Pope Francis wrote, "After centuries in which countless saints express with great fervor and eloquence their desire to go to heaven, Saint Therese could acknowledge with utter sincerity, 'At that time I was having great interior trials of all kinds, even to the point of asking myself if heaven really existed. And she said, when I sing of the happiness of heaven and the eternal possession of God, I feel no joy in this, for I sing simply what I want to believe." And then Pope Francis, in his apostolic letter, he takes one more step that I thought was brilliant. He makes this connection. He wrote, and I quote, "What happened? Therese was hearing God's call to put fire into the heart of the church," her version of "to be love in the heart of the church," more than to think of her personal happiness, of her salvation. The transformation that was taking place enabled her to pass from a fervent desire for heaven to a constant burning desire for the good of all, culminating in her dream of continuing in heaven, her mission of loving Jesus and of making him loved. As she wrote in one of her last letters, Pope Francis says, "I really count on not remaining inactive in heaven. My desire is to work still for the church and for souls." In those very days, Pope Francis says, "My heaven," and he's quoting Saint Therese, "my heaven will be spent on earth until the end of the world. Yes," she said, "I want to spend my heaven doing good on earth. There's no doubt about it, Saint Therese's whole life was a love poem. Her whole life was a love story, so often in the dark. Since her death of love, she has inspired so many of us to live a life of love. And that's what we've come looking for help with in this Congress. What a gift from Jesus Saint Therese is to us and to me. Let's do it. As she says, let's love him and make him greatly loved. Thank you, and God bless you.